This is Audible.
Dreamspinner Press presents CreatureFeature, including Diagnosis Wolf by Poppy Dennison and Landslide by Mary Kalma. Read for you by Jeff Gelder. Diagnosis Wolf by Poppy Dennison. Chapter 1. Andrew screeched when his phone rang and Call Me Maybe began to play at the highest possible volume. The ringtone was set for Sherry, the manager for the employment service he used to find work. He raced for the coffee table and snatched up his cell phone before the chorus ended. Hello? Andrew, hello. I hope to catch you today. I have a position you'd be great for. Thank goodness. Another week without a job and he wouldn't be able to pay rent this month. Andrew let out a sigh of relief. Wonderful. What are the details? Not that he could afford to be picky at this point, but he wouldn't be doing himself any favors by appearing too desperate. What's a great opportunity? Double your usual rates. Andrew groaned and collapsed onto his couch. What's the catch? Well, she hedged, drawing the word out to 4 or 5 syllables. The patient's father is somewhat difficult. Father? How old is the patient? Mid-20s. 25 and the father still handles his health care? This could be a disaster waiting to happen. Okay, Sherry, lay it on me. What exactly is somewhat difficult? Sherry groaned. That's the thing, I don't know. Apparently no one has gotten past the front door yet. They asked for a female, but I wanted to try sending you. It was Andrew's turn to groan. Sherry, that's crazy. What makes you think I'll get through? Hey, you're my last hope, buddy. If they turn you away, I'm going to have to send them to someone else. Andrew bit his lip and considered. It couldn't hurt to give it a try. He'd be no worse off than he was now if they turned him down. Okay, what's the address? An hour later, Andrew stood in front of one of the largest homes he'd ever seen. The massive front windows stretched up 2.5 stories. Nothing but crisp white stucco and glass. Andrew looked down at his faded blue scrubs with a grimace. Talk about sticking out like a sore thumb. He couldn't do anything about his appearance now, but Andrew had a feeling he understood why the other nurses hadn't gotten past the front door. He reflected on Sherry's description. Somewhat difficult. Right. If the perfection of this home were anything to go by, Andrew wouldn't last an hour. But at least that would be an hour at double his usual rate. It never ceased to amaze him how much his standards for acceptable behavior had lowered, since he didn't have the money to back him up. With a deep breath for courage, he straightened his spine and rang the bell. Not a sound came from inside. No way could something at this impeccable house be out of order. Even the shrubbery bowed down to the perfection of its surroundings. Not a leaf out of place. They wouldn't dare. No one answered after a long minute. Andrew fought the compulsion to just turn around and get back in his car. Surely another position would open up soon enough and get him out of this messy financial hole he'd found himself in. He hated having to take a job based on the money alone. So what if they made him drive all the way out here and didn't answer the door? Not like he had much of a choice, despite the fact that his potential employers appeared to be rude and inconsiderate of his time. The reality of his situation forced him to keep his feet planted on the front steps. The problem with having a brother who looked enough like you to be your twin? He sometimes wrote checks with his mouth that his ass couldn't cash. And he did them using your ID, which meant that Andrew's ass couldn't cash them either. Now he had a mountain of debts and an on-again, off-again job that paid his living expenses, but not much else. Andrew couldn't remember if gambling was one of the 7 deadly sins, but if it wasn't, the vice certainly should be. Andrew stood impatiently on the stoop, cursing his brother's addiction and his own trusting heart that had allowed Danny access to his accounts. That heart of his would sink him yet. All he'd have had to do was call the bank or the cops or press charges. The debt would have disappeared. But Andrew hadn't been able to send his brother to jail. He pressed the doorbell again and thanked his lucky stars that the weather felt like cooperating. Not that fall in Arizona meant freezing weather, but with the sun shining, Andrew didn't worry about his scrubs not being warm enough for brisk weather. The door opened, finally. The largest man in the world stood on the other side. Dressed in a black suit, he brushed the jacket aside far enough to let Andrew see the weapon holstered under his arm. Shitballs! What the hell had he gotten himself into this time? You're the nurse? Tall, dark, and scowly asked, his voice deep and a bit on the creepy side. Unfortunately for him, Andrew watched a lot of horror movies. This guy had nothing on Vincent Price. Yes, Andrew answered with a brief smile of reassurance. You're a guy? Well, yes. I'm Andrew. Whatever. You won't be here long enough for me to bother learning your name. With that, he turned and stalked through the foyer. Nice to meet you, too. Andrew growled under his breath. He stepped onto the white marble tiles, then bounced right back out to wipe his crot-covered feet on the doormat. He stayed close to the door and hiked his scruffy black duffel further onto his shoulder. When a strand of his shaggy blonde hair blew across his cheek, Andrew tucked it behind his ear. He probably should have made time for a quick trim, but that was something else that required cash, and he was currently tapped out. Get in here, Scowley commanded from a doorway near the back of the huge entrance hall. Andrew started to snap a salute and say, yes, sir, but thought he'd better not. He walked down the hall, the foam resin in his shoes squeaking with each step across the glistening floor. Andrew expected to meet whoever was in charge, but instead, he faced a large stairwell. Scowley marched up the steps, his perfectly shined black dress shoes not making a sound. Andrew followed him down another long white hall to the only room with a closed door. Scowley opened the door a crack and stuck his head inside. The nurse is here. He pitched his voice very low, not quite a whisper, with his deep bass. Andrew heard a whispered reply. Send her in. Scowley jerked his head and gestured for Andrew to enter the room. Dark curtains shrouded the windows, and a hospital bed sat against a long, empty wall. The only light in the room came from a door at the opposite side of the room from the bed that was open just a crack. Another Scowley wannabe sat in a chair by the window, dressed in a similar dark suit. This guy also had the bulge of a hidden weapon under his coat. Andrew took all of the information in and processed it before he turned to look at the man on the bed. The darkness of the room hid his features for the most part, but Andrew could see well enough to know his patient was a very sick man. His pale skin looked ashen, and his dark hair fell in messy, sweat-dampened waves against his forehead. No other equipment surrounded the bed, only empty spaces where monitors and IV poles normally stood. Andrew didn't see any charts around either. Where is charts? Andrew hissed at the presumed bodyguards. You don't need them. Andrew bristled. No Scowley, gun or not, told him how to take care of his patients. The hell I don't. Get me his medical files. Ignoring the request, Scowley snorted and sat down in the chair. Fine then. Nice knowing you. Andrew turned around and stormed back to the bedroom door. He heard a menacing growl behind him, like that of a dog ready to attack. Andrew froze and glanced over his shoulder. Where do you think you're going? Scowley marched up behind Andrew and reached for his arm. Andrew spun out of the way. Don't touch me, asshole. And I'm leaving. I can't treat this guy if I don't have his files. Since you won't give them to me, you'll need to find another nurse. Andrew turned to leave again, and the growl sounded from behind him for the second time. And someone needs to get control of that dog, wherever it is. Scowley number 2 huffed out a laugh. I'm out of here. Andrew slipped into the hall. He froze when he noticed an older man at the top of the stairs. Elegantly dressed in a light linen suit, the man had perfectly styled white hair and the deep olive skin of someone with Spanish or maybe Italian roots. As Andrew grew closer, the man grew shorter. For some reason, he'd appeared to be very tall, but he was actually only 5'5" or so. He looked up to Andrew's 6-foot height. Something in the older man's eyes made Andrew stop and wait. No doubt Scowley's 1 and 2 worked for this guy. The man exuded power. I'm Alphonse DiMartino. He held out his hand to Andrew. Andrew Hughes, if you'll excuse me, I was just leaving. He gave Alphonse's hand a quick shake out of politeness and tried to scoot around him for the stairs. Andrew, please wait. I'm not sure what the boys did this time, but I'd like to speak to you before you rush off. Andrew stopped and turned around. I'll give you 10 minutes. I'm sorry to be abrupt with you, sir, but those jerks have crawled all over my nerves. And that damn dog keeps growling. Oh, really? Alphonse snapped his fingers, and the bodyguard shot through the door. Monty? Jed? Care to explain why our new nurse is leaving before I had a chance to meet with him? And while you're at it, perhaps one of you would like to tell me why I shouldn't put... Oh, how did you put it, Andrew? Oh, yes. The damn dog out of its misery. Monty and Jed weren't scowling now. In fact, the two appeared downright terrified. Sorry, sir. Oh, we were just... Jed started to explain, but couldn't seem to decide what to say. Enough. Get out of my sight. They skedaddled so fast, Andrew wondered just how much a hold Alphonse had over them. My apologies, Andrew. If you would consider staying on, I'll take care that nothing like that happens again. Andrew thought for a moment and considered the paycheck. He needed this job. He had to admit that seeing the lurch wannabes put in their place was a nice bonus. I'll stay. If I don't have to deal with those two any more than necessary, I'll see what I can do. Now, if you'll follow me, I'd like to introduce you to my son. Andrew followed Alphonse back into the bedroom. The older man opened one of the curtains and allowed light to shine into the room. The patient had dark hair that curled over his ears. Alphonse smoothed the stray curl off his son's forehead and placed a gentle kiss on his cheek. This is my Caleb. He's been ill and needs some additional care for a while until I can make things right. Make things right? Andrew wasn't sure what that meant. But the young man had clearly been ill for a while. From the looks of him, Andrew couldn't be sure how much more time his father could take to make things right. Caleb's skin, although the same rich tan as his father's, also held a pallid gray tone that indicated a severe amount of pain. Andrew's fingers twitched to check his pulse, but he stayed back. Caleb's condition is more than a medical one. I'm afraid it's difficult to explain, but he needs more assistance than my guards can provide. They resent that fact, unfortunately. Because of my business, I require protection. Needless to say, my bodyguards don't like strangers in the house. Look, Mr. Alphonse, I'm not sure I'm the right person for the job. I mean, you can have me checked out or whatever, but I can't in good conscience agree to take care of your son when I don't even know what's wrong with him. Alphonse turned to Andrew and smiled. How about we make you a deal? You work with us for 3 days. If at the end of that time you believe you can function as my son's caregiver, I will provide you with more information. He should say no and get the hell out of here. The temptation of 3 days of work at the rates Alphonse was paying tipped the scales. He'd have over a week's worth of hours in those few days, enough to get some unsavory creditors off his back for a little longer. 3 days? Yes. If it works out, I'll make sure you have all the information you need. Andrew dropped his bag at the foot of the bed and held out his hand to the older man. Deal. Alphonse smiled briefly before straightening his spine and getting back to business. Andrew's patient's father was not only powerful, but obviously accustomed to getting his way. He gave Andrew a brief rundown of how they'd been treating Caleb, including the few medications they'd been giving him. Andrew didn't have a chance to ask many questions, as Alphonse